Good afternoon, and welcome to NASA's Johnson Space Center. I'm Mira Bernstein in NASA's Office of Communications. Thank you for joining us today and for an update on NASA's Boeing Starliner crew flight test. To give you an update, we have NASA Administrator Bill Nelson, Associate Administrator Jim Free, Associate Administrator for Space Operations Ken Bowersox, Commercial Crew Program Manager Steve Stitch, International Space Station Program Manager Dana Weigel, and Flight Operations Director Norm Knight. We'll be taking questions from those in the room and over the phone. As a reminder, you can press *1 to get into the queue. But first, I'd like to hand it over to Administrator Nelson for opening remarks.
Thanks. NASA has decided that Butch and Sonny will return with Crew 9 next February, and that Starliner will return uncrewed, and the specifics in the schedule will be discussed momentarily. I want you to know that Boeing has worked very hard with NASA to get the necessary data to make this decision. We want to further understand the root causes and understand the design improvements so that the Boeing Starliner will serve as an important part of our assured crew access to the ISS. I have just talked to the new Boeing CEO, Kelly Ortberg. I have expressed this to him. I told him how well Boeing worked with our team to come to this decision. And he expressed to me an intention that they will continue to work the problems once Starliner is back safely, and that we will have our redundancy and our crewed access to the space station. This whole discussion, remember, is put in the context of we have had mistakes done in the past. We lost 2 space shuttles as a result of there not being a culture in which information could come forward. We have been very solicitous of all of our employees that if you have some objection, you come forward. Space flight is risky, even at its safest, and even at its most routine. And a test flight by nature is neither safe nor routine. And so the decision to keep Butch and Sonny aboard the International Space Station and bring the Boeing Starliner home uncrewed is a result of a commitment to safety. Our core value is safety, and it is our North Star. And I'm grateful to NASA and to Boeing for their teams, for all the incredible and detailed work to get to this decision. Turn it over to Jim.
Thank you, sir. Thank you and Deputy Administrator Melroy for your support along the way, and certainly for being here today. It means a lot. I'd like to communicate to all of you that we've come to this decision using our program, our mission directorate, and our agency level processes. That includes the decisions that happen at the commercial crew program, at the space operations mission directorate level, and the agency level, and includes all of our technical authorities from engineering, safety, medical, and flight operations. As the administrator said, our focus is on safety all the time, and this certainly is no different. The uncertainty in our margins is where we have come to make the decision that the administrator laid out. That uncertainty remains in our understanding of the physics going on in the thrusters, and we still have some work to go. You'll hear more from others on the specifics, but I'll tell you that the NASA and Boeing team have made incredible technical progress in the model development that has gone on, the thruster testing, understanding material properties within the valve, and the complicated fluid physics that are happening inside. We will continue to learn. We are a learning organization, and I think we've demonstrated that here. We'll learn from this effort so that our crews who are at the top of the pyramid on these missions and their families can continue to know we've done that and we'll always do our best. For our team, our programmatic and technical teams, both NASA and the Commercial Crew Program and the Space Station Program and our Boeing teammates have worked endlessly to get to launch, and certainly in the past 2 months. They've done this while the whole world has gone on around them. Hurricanes, a hurricane through Florida, a hurricane through here, while their homes are damaged and without power, they came to work. Some of them lost family members along the way. Their kids went back to school and life in general went on, but they were here every day working long hours. They have persevered, and I want them to know how grateful I am that they are on our team. This has not been an easy decision, but it is absolutely the right one. Let me turn it over to Ken Bowersox and thank Ken and all the leaders here and the ones that are not here with us today for their work.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks to you and the administrator for joining us for this press conference and for our meetings. You guys have been heavily involved, and we appreciate that. I also want to thank everybody who's here in the room with us and watching online. It says a lot that you're with us on a Saturday, and I want you to know how much we appreciate your support as we work to fly our mission safely. I'm really proud of the NASA team and the Boeing team for all the work they've been doing the last couple of months. It's really been impressive to see how they've been very agile in testing, gathering data, and completing analysis. And then having the tough discussions that go along with processing that data and coming to conclusions. Our intent today was to have the first part of a flight readiness review. The goal of that review was to come up with a NASA recommendation on whether we should proceed with the crewed flight test, either crewed or uncrewed. Our Boeing partners told us that they would be able to execute either option, and they thought that the call belonged to NASA because of our wider view of all the risks involved. We conducted a poll. All of the organizations on the polling sheet indicated that they thought we should proceed uncrewed with the flight test. And so our next step will be to process toward that uncrewed flight test. To finish those preparations, and we'll have another part 2 of the readiness review Wednesday or Thursday next week, we believe, to make sure that we're ready for undock and to complete the test. We are still in the middle of a test flight. We have to remain vigilant. We need to get the vehicle back on deck, go through the data. And once we've done that, we'll start thinking about our next steps for Starliner's next flight. And now I'd like to pass the mic to Steve to share more info and more details.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks for the kind words. I want to thank all of you for being here and the public and everybody for following our progress over the summer. It's been a long summer. It's been a long summer for our team. And I want to first start out by thanking our team who's worked so hard over the summer, long hours, weekends, nights, testing, analysis, reviews. I mean, it has just been an incredible effort by the team. We are dealing with a very complex issue with the thrusters, and I'll talk more about that, but it's challenging to predict their performance. It's challenging to predict the temperatures we'll see. And so that's why it's been tough, and it's taken the time ever since we docked back on June 6th to get to this point. Very proud of the due diligence that the team has displayed, their perseverance, their fortitude, courage, dedication, resilience as they learned more and we got more data and different results at times than we expected. I especially want to thank the Boeing team and their contractor team, Aerojet Rocketdyne, the engine manufacturer, the valve manufacturer, Moog, all their suppliers that participated, along with the NASA workforce. We have brought in expertise from just about every NASA center. We did testing at the Marshall Space Flight Center. Of course, our White Sands test facility did testing on the thrusters. So this has been a huge effort across all of NASA within the commercial crew program and even beyond. Determining the position to bring Starliner back uncrewed was very difficult for me personally. We're all committed to the mission, which we started out, which is to bring Butch and Sunny back. But as we got more and more data over the summer and understood the uncertainty of that data, it became very clear to us that the best course of action was to return Starliner uncrewed. And I'll talk about the other aspects of the mission in a little bit. The bottom line relative to bringing Starliner back is there was just too much uncertainty in the prediction of the thrusters. If we had a model, if we had a way to accurately predict what the thrusters would do for the undock and all the way through the deorbit burn and through the separation sequence, I think we would have taken a different course of action. But when we looked at the data and looked at the potential for thruster failures with a crew on board, and then getting into this very tight sequence of finishing the deorbit burn, which puts the vehicle on an entry, and then immediately maneuvering from that into a SEP sequence to separate the service module and crew module, it was just too much risk with the crew, and so we decided to pursue the uncrewed test flight. The path forward now is to, as Ken said, work toward the Flight Readiness Review Part 2. Well, we review now. We know the scope of the mission. We know it's an uncrewed test flight. We are changing the separation sequence that we planned, and we will review those aspects at the readiness review. We're going to go with a simplified separation technique to get away from station a little more quickly. We'll get to the deorbit burn and execute that nominally. We have a good setup in terms of the opportunities into the White Sands Space Harbor for a number of opportunities in September. We'll land or undock in early September, and then we have a lot of work to do relative to the rest of the mission, which is Butch and Sunny stay on the space station for some time and they return on Crew 9. We're configuring that spacecraft with a couple extra, 2 different seats. So we'll have 2 different crew members, 2 crew members on that vehicle, and then we'll have it ready to bring Butch and Sunny home. So they'll be ballast in 2 seats on the uphill. We also have to work to reconfigure the Crew 8 vehicle. When Starliner undocks, it will undock first. And then the Crew 8 vehicle will serve as the lifeboat for Butch and Sunny. We have a configuration on the cargo pallet we'll go put in place. So again, we'll get Calypso home when we're ready to do so. We're going to take our time taking the steps, each step along the way. We'll have an important simulation ahead of that flight readiness review with the flight control team. You know, if you put yourself in their place, they have practiced for 2 years to bring a crew home on Starliner. There are some differences in executing the undock sequence and the coast to the deorbit burn and the deorbit burn without a crew. And so they're going to practice that next week. I'm extremely grateful for the commercial crew program, the entire team. It's an honor to represent them here today, and I'll turn it over to Dana Weigel.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you all very much for being here, for your interest in this historic test flight mission and also in the International Space Station. As you heard, with the decision to leave Butch and Sunny on board till February, they'll be with us on station for 8 months. I think most of you know our normal expedition durations are 6 months long, but we have had a number of flights with astronauts who've stayed on board with us for 12 months at a time. So this 8-month stay is very much within our normal operational experience base. While Butch and Sunny are on board, they'll be doing science, station maintenance. They'll execute the SpaceX 31 research and cargo mission, and we may have a couple spacewalks for them towards the end of their expedition. Since they've been up there, they've been a welcome set of helping hands. They've already done about 100 hours of work on 42 different experiments, and they've helped us with some of the critical station maintenance that we've had on board. For us, looking forward, the station team is focused on the planning and the rework for the undock, the Starliner undock. As you heard from Steve, that's targeted for early September. Before we hit that undock window, We're going to do the work to reconfigure the Crew 8 Dragon. We'll probably do that within the next week or so to have that in place for a 6-crew contingency return capability. And just to reiterate, as Steve said, this just gives us a contingency capability after Starliner departs and before the Crew 9 vehicle arrives. Crew 9 with 2 crew will launch no earlier than September 24th. We'll do a normal handover between the crews, and then we'll have Crew 8 undock. After that, we will relocate the Crew 9 vehicle. So that Dragon vehicle will be relocated to open up the forward port for the SpaceX 31 cargo mission. And we're planning that mission somewhere in mid-October. In between all of that, we've got a Soyuz crew exchange. That's happening September 11th will be the launch of 73S. That'll be carrying NASA astronaut Don Pettit. And then Tracy Dyson will go home after that Soyuz exchange. So we've got a lot of busy activities in front of us this fall. On behalf of the station program, I do want to thank the entire team, the commercial crew program, the Boeing team, and all of our technical teams. They've done a tremendous amount of work over the summer, getting us to the point where we have enough data and enough information to make this really critical and difficult decision that we've made today. So very much appreciated. And as I think all of you know, commercial crew program is critical to the success of ISS. So we appreciate everything they've done. And with that, I'll hand it over to Norm Knight.
Thank you, Dana. I want to thank all of you for your continued interest in our mission. And I want to echo my gratitude for the teams on the ground, both Boeing and NASA, and our astronauts on board for their tireless work and effort with this test flight over many years, especially during the last few months. You know, with the dedication to, or the decision to fly Starliner home uncrewed, the ground teams will still be fully engaged, ensuring Starliner returns safely. You know, while the teams are hard at work here on the ground, we also have Butch and Sunny living and working 260 miles above our planet. They're giving our teams valuable feedback on Starliner. They've served as an integral part of our on-orbit increment. And they demonstrated patience, adaptability, flexibility, resilience, and readiness. That's what you get with an American astronaut. They've been eager to contribute to important conversations. They've asked questions. They've seamlessly become part of the Expedition 71 crew, contributing to the important work on board the International Space Station. You know, when you're charting new paths for exploration, there are highs and lows. We all know this. It's part of exploration and moving forward. Spaceflight is hard. The margins are thin. The space environment is not forgiving. And we have to be right. We all know this. This was a tough problem to be solved, and a decision had to be made. I want you to remember, Starliner is a robust vehicle with excellent flying qualities, as evidenced by the manual demonstration accomplished by Butch prior to docking. And Starliner has performed exceptionally well overall, so please don't lose sight of that. This is a test flight, and the thruster issue and the associated investigations will pay huge dividends in the future for human exploration in a great way when Starliner flies again. I am encouraged by the dedication and resilience both the NASA and Boeing ground teams and, of course, our space flyers exhibit. I talked with Butch and Sunny both yesterday and today. They support the agency's decision fully, and they're ready to continue this mission on board ISS as members of the Expedition 71 crew. I would also be remiss not to mention that this decision also affects the Crew 9 mission and the astronauts that are assigned to fly in that mission in September. Crew 9 mission will now configure Dragon for 2 crew members and will provide seats for Butch and Sunny to return. We're also working to finalize those crew assignments and update the training plan. Those decisions will be made public once they are finalized. I would again like to thank all the teams who have designed, built, and now fly Starliner. Going forward, their hard work will continue to pave the path for expanded human spaceflight exploration. Thanks.
Thanks, Norm. We'll move into the question and answer portion now. We'll open it up again to folks in the room and folks on the phone. If you're on the phone, press *1 to get into the queue. Please clearly state which of our participants you are addressing in your question, and we appreciate you limiting yourself to one question. So with that, yeah, in the back.
Mark Strassman, CBS News. This could be for Jim or Ken or Steve. I'll let you decide. My question is about trust. Space flight is a business that's built on trust. You trust that everyone's going to do their job. You have to have trust in all your space partners. Boeing essentially said, trust us. We have a spacecraft that is ready to return astronauts home. And NASA went in a different direction. So how now do you begin to rebuild that relationship of trust with Boeing?
I mean, I'll start. I don't think it's a trust issue at all. I don't think we're rebuilding trust. I think we're looking at the data, and we view the data and the uncertainty that's there differently than Boeing does. It's not a matter of trust. It's our technical expertise and our experience that we have to balance. And I think Ken said it. We balance risk across everything, not just the Starliner piece. So I don't see it as a trust issue at all. I guess Ken or Stitch. Yeah.
Well, I would say that we've had a lot of tense discussions, right? Because the call was close, and so people have emotional investment in either option, and that gives you a healthy discourse. But after that, you have to do some work to keep your team together, right? To keep your team restored and ready for the next issue. And I'll acknowledge that we have some work to do there. It's pretty natural whenever you've had a difficult decision to make. But we're aware of it, and we'll work it. And we're committed to continuing to work with Boeing. Steve, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily call it trust. I would call it a technical disagreement where we get a group of engineers together and they disagree on the risk level of what could potentially happen to the thrusters. Boeing did a great job building a model. Now, the question is that model good enough to predict performance for a crew? All the work we've done is really important also for bringing this vehicle back. We want the vehicle to come back uncrewed. It needs to land at the White Sands Space Harbor, which is where the opportunities are setting up in September. And all the work that we've done, both on the NASA and Boeing side, give us confidence to bring the vehicle back. It has to execute a deorbit burn. It has to do all the things we need it to do, undocking from the space station safely. So I think together we have worked toward that part. There was just a little disagreement in terms of the level of risk. And that's kind of where it got down to. And I would say, it's close. It's very close, and it just depends on, how you evaluate the risk. We did it a little differently with our crew than Boeing did.
And Mark, trust is a two-way street, and it's built upon a relationship. And I think, as indicated just an hour ago by the new CEO of Boeing, that they intend to move forward and fly Starliner in the future, which is very important to NASA, that we have two human-rated vehicles. I think you should understand the trust is two ways.
Eric Berger with Ars Technica. Two questions. One for the administrator, just to follow up on that question about Boeing and your discussion with the Boeing CEO, Kelly Ortberg. How do you anticipate that NASA can help Boeing get Starliner operational missions? Could you maybe fly like a cargo mission to support that, or just curious what your thoughts are on that? And then for, I think, Ken Bowersox, curious, when did you think it was likely that Crew Dragon would be the vehicle to bring the crew home, Butch and Sonny? From the outside, it does seem like that you saw something perhaps in the White Sands test data that gave you concern. It certainly seemed like that's when the odds seem to shift toward Dragon. Would love any insights on that. Thank you.
Your question to me is best answered by the people that are going to determine the specific testing and what is required before the crew would fly.
Yeah, I can take a cut at that, Eric. So we're going to sit down with Boeing and kind of lay out what's that path, right? I would say the White Sands testing did give us a surprise. We saw in that testing, as we did 5 total simulations with that thruster of a downhill deorbit burn sequence. And so that's when we saw this swelling of the poppet on the oxidizer side. In other words, a piece of Teflon that swells up and it gets in the flow path and causes the oxidizer to not go into the thruster the way it needs to go into. And that's what caused the degradation in thrust. When we saw that, I think that's when things changed a bit for us, in that now we know that's prevalent, and where is it prevalent in other thrusters, and then what could that swelling do in the future. So that's, I think, where we change course. What we have to do now moving forward for Starliner 1 is how do we avoid firing that thruster in a manner that would cause the heating that causes that oxidizer poppet Teflon piece to swell? Can we figure out how to do that with some testing? And can we also have learned recently that the environment in the doghouse, and I think I've talked about this, is hotter than we thought. In other words, when the other thrusters fire in a doghouse, some of that heat soaks back into an individual thruster, and that causes the Teflon to swell. It also causes some vaporization of the propellant. So is there a way we can figure out how to get the doghouse cooler overall? And then thirdly, we see crosstalk sometimes when an OMAC, the orbital maneuvering engine, the big 1,500-pound thruster fires, it then causes heat on one of the adjacent thrusters. So we've got to sit down and go through all those details with Boeing, with Aerojet. The teams have been so focused over the last couple of months at understanding the physics and what's going on, which we have a much better understanding of that now. Now that we have that understanding of the physics, I think we can move forward and start to find mitigations for future flights. Yeah. See if Ken has anything to add.
Well, for me, the White Sands results I thought were a gift. It was just great to have that data. And I really thought it might help us converge. I've seen it with a few of our discussions where we have people in different camps on a risk decision. We gather more data, and then a piece of data comes in, and we come together, and everybody agrees that we take one path or the other. And I thought we might get there until probably about a week ago, I'd say. That's where it started looking like, hey, I just don't think we'll get there in time for bringing Starliner home in a timely manner. With more time, we might have gotten a lot smarter, but we're just at the point where we need to bring Starliner home, take all the data we can, and keep moving forward, I think.
Next question is from Marcia Dunn on the phone lines. Marcia Dunn from Associated Press.
Yes, hi. For you, Ken, I'd like a little more information on how the opinions were split. Was it 50-50, 75 to 25% in favor of SpaceX? If you could just characterize the numbers for and against, and also if you could discuss the mood in the room today. Thank you.
The polling was unanimous amongst all the NASA folks. Boeing expressed the ability to either work crewed or uncrewed. They believe in their vehicle, and they'd be willing to bring a crew home on it. We had some NASA folks that took a broader view of the global risks, who thought that, hey, we probably should keep the crew on the test flight. To say whether that was 15, 20% of the people, I'd have a hard time coming up with that number. But as far as the mood, all of us really wanted to complete the test flight with crew, and I think unanimously we're disappointed not to be able to do that. But that's part of the reason our system is set up the way it is, right? You don't want that disappointment to weigh unhealthily in your decision. And so on purpose, our system increases the volume on some of our voices from the technical authorities, folks that are asked not to think about those emotions. And it helps to pull you away from the fact that you might be disappointed in a certain decision and then guide you towards that final outcome.
And I would add on the mood in the room, I think everybody is professional and did their jobs, but there is a sense of not accomplishing the mission that we set out to do. And even for myself personally, that is a hard thing to go through. It's a little bit of a situation of loss and feeling like you lost something. And we haven't, in the ultimate long-term view, we have not lost anything, because Boeing as the Administrator Nelson said, is committed to finding the solutions and flying Starliner again. But I probably can't express in words what it's like when you commit to a mission, you've worked on a mission so long, and then we make a fairly dramatic change, which we have not done in human spaceflight in a long time. And so there's a feeling of loss, and we'll work with our team to make sure we talk about that and we move forward from here, because we need this team to focus not only on returning Starliner safely, but we have a Crew 8 mission to return and reconfigure. We have a Crew 9 launch coming up as well, and we need to focus on all those things. We have a really busy time frame, and we'll do that. We'll talk to the team and make sure they understand that it's nobody's fault, and it's a normal feeling to have this feeling of loss or that you didn't complete what you intended to do.
Okay, we'll take the next question also from the phone lines from Marissa Para from NBC News.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for doing this. Marissa Para with NBC here. Senator Nelson, this could be for you or for anyone else who wants to join in. We heard a mention of a next space flight for Starliner a couple of times, and we know how much NASA would like to have an alternative to SpaceX, more companies available to provide the ability to shuttle astronauts to the ISS. Senator Nelson, how certain are you that Boeing will ever launch Starliner with a crew on board again?
100%.
100%.
Correct.
There is no shadow of a doubt in your mind. Can you explain why?
Because of what this panel has already told you. The extensive cooperative working relationship between NASA and Boeing, of finding the problem, but knowing that the uncertainties are what held up the crew getting on Starliner to go home, and a certainty on my part that we will find out the uncertainty, and Boeing's willingness to carry through on this program.
All right, next question from the phones, Kristen Fisher from CNN.
Thank you. My question is also for Senator Nelson. Senator, you were a member of the congressional committee that investigated the Challenger accident. You were a senator when Columbia happened. How much did that experience influence your personal decision today? Thank you.
Well, very much. It has affected the decision today by this collective group and all of those that participated in the flight test readiness review this morning. It is a trying to turn around the culture that first led to the loss of Challenger and then led to the loss of Columbia, where obvious mistakes were not being brought forth. For example, give you specifics going back to the loss of Challenger. Even the engineers in Utah, in Morton Thiokol, were begging their management not to launch because of the cold weather. And that information never got up. And that was happening on the very night before the launch the next morning. Another example, on Columbia, astronauts would get through with their flights and they'd inspect the orbiter, and they'd, as a matter of fact, my commander, Hoot Gibson, said he'd look at subsequent flights and he would look like that a shotgun had been shot on the delicate silicon tiles because of so much of the foam shedding off of the external tank. But there was a culture that did not bring that information up to the decision makers. So NASA ever since has tried very hard to bring about an atmosphere in which people are encouraged to step forward and speak their mind. And I think right today is a good example of that.
Do we have other questions in the room? Yep, back left.
Good morning, Cheryl Mercedes here with KHOU here in Houston, Texas. Any of you can answer this question. Just really simply state it to the folks at home who have no idea what these two astronauts are experiencing right now up in orbit. All they're hearing is the technical stuff and what we're reporting. What do you have to say to those folks who are saying, man, these guys simply are going to miss out on the holidays with their families at home? What's it like for them up there? What are they experiencing day to day now with this decision and this news that it will now be months before they return? Thank you.
I'll jump in on this one. First off, all the astronauts on station are professionals. All those qualities I talked about with Butch and Sunny, that's exemplified in every astronaut that flies to the International Space Station. They're professionals. When they launch, they know that there are circumstances where they can be on board for up to a year. So mentally, you know that you could be in that situation. Now, once you're in the arena, obviously, it's a little different. It's challenging. It's disappointing that they're not coming home on Starliner, but that's okay. It's a test flight. That's what we do. They knew those risks going in, but we keep them very busy. There's a lot of science and research going on the International Space Station that Dana can elaborate on and has elaborated on. We keep them busy. We keep them working, and they are continuing to pave the road for human exploration going forward. So it's great. They're part of the crew, and they're doing fine.
What do you say to their families?
I care deeply about their families. I know this is a huge impact to their families, and it means a lot. Their families are the pillars that keep them strong. They're the pillars that we at NASA depend on for the workforce to keep us going. They're the pillars that help this team with the crewed flight test have the resilience to keep going, especially over these last 2 months that were needed to go forward. And that's both at NASA and Boeing. So family is the backbone of what we do in the support structure. So I tell their families, thank you. Thank you for their support. Thank you for what they do to allow NASA and our commercial partners to do what we do to explore space.
We're going to go back to the phone lines. Next is Eben Brown from Fox News.
Hi, good afternoon. Eben Brown, Fox News for Administrator Nelson. Sir, I can appreciate all the technical and R&D review here that's being detailed for us and the investment everyone has in this. But I'd like to ask you about the investment we as taxpayers have given to Boeing over, I think it's at least 15 years now. It's been hundreds of millions from seed money to selecting them as providers for commercial crew. At what point, and I understand this is an oversight issue and it may come from something above the agency, but your career has spanned both the agency and above the agency, and I want to know how or when or what's the process for reviewing this contract to determine we're not getting what we paid for as taxpayers. I say this as knowing that there is a public sentiment that is very skeptical of Boeing as a corporation right now, not just due to this, but also due to their other issues in commercial aviation. So I'd like to know when those discussions happen and how they happen and what gets discussed.
To specifically answer your question, you remember when we started the commercial program, one of the advantages of the commercial program was that it was going to be a fixed price contract. So much of NASA's research and development in a very unforgiving environment, space, that is very hard and is cutting edge technology, and it is very expensive. And as a result, on the normal way of contracting, cost plus, it will run the cost way up. Not so with the commercial crew program. And that was part of the negotiation for both of the companies, Boeing and SpaceX. And they've got a fixed price. And if you check the record, you can find out how much additional Boeing has had to spend. So my answer, you're posturing the question of what I would answer in front of a congressional committee about the cost, is that this program is working like it should. Now, if your question portends something else, then speak it, but I think that's what you were getting at.
Okay, we'll go to Joey Roulette from Reuters.
Thanks. For Bill Nelson, did Kelly Ortberg say when you talked to him whether Boeing would pay for an additional test mission before Starliner gets certified? And for Steve or Ken, I'm reading some contract language from Boeing's most recent modification that says it kind of broadly defines certification as coming after Starliner flies astronauts to and from the ISS. And so I know there's a lot of data that you guys are going to get on the return leg, but since it's coming back empty and based on what we've seen so far, will NASA want to see Boeing fly an additional test mission before it gets its certification, or might NASA change those requirements and certify Starliner anyway?
Joey, it did not come up, nor would it have been appropriate for, in a conversation of which I'm alerting him as to what the decision of the flight test readiness review was, that we would get into those matters.
Yeah, we've started looking at the flight test objectives, what we have already accomplished on this flight and what's remaining. We have not, made a total determination yet of what objectives are in front of us or what we've fulfilled. We'll take a little time to do that. I don't think we have decided on the path yet of another crewed flight test. We have gotten a lot out of this vehicle so far. It's been on orbit now for 2.5 months, which we didn't intend. So we've got a lot of data out of that. We'll have to sit down and talk about the certification aspects after the flight. It's a little premature to do that at this point.
Yeah, we need to get the vehicle back on the ground and then analyze the data and be driven by that in our next decision. But I wouldn't rule anything out, right? I mean, we have options for how we move forward. The one thing I do want to emphasize is we plan to work together with Boeing to find that path.
Next, we have Chris Davenport from the Washington Post.
Hi, thanks so much. I guess for Ken Bowersox, I want to follow up on that poll, which you said was unanimous. I wonder if you can give us a number of votes cast that was as part of that poll. Was it like 10-0, 12? How many votes were there? Thank you.
Well, so I'll kind of go through just mentally all the orgs we polled. We unofficially asked the opinion of the NASA Engineering and Safety Center, the Flight Operations Directorate, the Division Director for ISS and Commercial LEO Development at NASA headquarters, the ISS program, the Commercial Crew Program, the Engineering Technical Authority, the Crew Health and Medical Technical Authority, Safety and Mission Assurance Technical Authority. Let's see, who else did I leave out? All the center directors from Stennis, Marshall, JSC, and Kennedy Space Center, where the Commercial Crew Program is officially based. Anybody I missed on that list?
I think you got just about everybody.
I think did I get everybody? And that was again, everybody concurred with proceeding uncrewed, and they stated where they might have one or two people during our meeting that had a different opinion and tried to give those folks an opportunity to talk to the group.
We'll go to Micah Maidenberg from Wall Street Journal.
Thank you. For Administrator Nelson and Jim Free, there was a discussion on a previous call about Starliner returning uncrewed, if that would count as a loss of mission or mission failure. What is your view on that? And if you don't agree that it would be a loss of mission or mission failure, could you please explain why? Thanks.
Yeah, Mike, I think let me go back to echo something Steve said. We've accomplished a lot on this mission and learned a lot about this vehicle, satisfied a lot of the objectives already. That stressed here by Steve, stressed on previous press conferences. We'll look at this as we do any of our missions to see, does it fall into any of the categories that we define as a mishap once we get the vehicle back? That's our time to look at that. So I think that's a question I'd save and pose to us on the other side of getting the vehicle back.
We'll go to Izzy Alvarez from ABC.
Thank you. Can you please tell us in layman terms why NASA chose SpaceX to bring Sunny and Butch home? How did you come to that decision?
I can take a cut at that, and we'll see. When we looked at, first of all, we looked at the risk of putting Butch and Sunny on the Starliner vehicle due to the issues with the thrusters that we've talked about. And so when we looked at that risk, we said that risk was due to the uncertainties, due to the inability to predict with certainty the thruster performance for the rest of the mission, including holding the orientation of the vehicle for the deorbit burn and then maneuvering the vehicle for the separation of the crew module and the service module. When we came to that conclusion, we started looking at what other options, Dana and I both did, what options do we have? Because these missions are really jointly shared between the ISS program and commercial crew program. And as we started looking at various options, it was obvious to both of us that the easiest and best option was to configure the Crew 9 vehicle with a couple empty seats on the way uphill to put ballast in those seats. SpaceX had that capability. We also knew that we had a spacesuit on orbit already that we could utilize for one of the crew members. They've tried that on, and that spacesuit works. Both crew members tried on a spacesuit, so we have a spacesuit now we're going to launch for one of the other crew members on Crew 9. And then we really wanted to give the crew, a suited return like we always have in U.S. space flight. So when we started to weigh all those options, it became very obvious that Crew 9 was the best option. Fly up 2 empty seats, have Butch and Sunny join the increment crew and return on Crew 9. That just became the easiest, the best option, and the most efficient option for all of us. And I'll see if Dana has anything to add.
Yeah, I would just add that, knowing that this was a test flight, we made the decision a couple of years ago to train and keep Butch and Sunny current with all aspects of station, some of the most complex things we do, spacewalks, robotics, some of the research. So we had them trained. They've obviously flown to station before. They've done long duration missions. Both of them have. And so again, when you line that up with our vehicle options and the fact that the Dragon spacecraft is highly automated, as you all know, we've used it for private astronaut missions. We do have a lot of experience taking people with much less training than what our classic training is for our NASA crew and having them fly on Dragons. And so when you look at that in aggregate, it made a lot of sense to make the decision to adjust Crew 9 and have them do a full expedition and come home on a Dragon.
And one thing I'd like to add, a major goal of the commercial crew program is to develop not just the capability to go back and forth to space station, but a generic capability to go back and forth to low Earth orbit to develop a commercial capability. There's two reasons for that. One is dissimilar redundancy. So you have this option where if there's a problem on one vehicle, you might not have the same problem on another vehicle. So you could use them for a return or perhaps keep them flying while another vehicle is working through recovery from some sort of a problem. But it's also to provide some competition in the environment. And competition is healthy in a lot of ways. It causes you to develop your technology. It causes you to get better pricing. And we would like to have that competition in the future. So that's why we have more than one provider we're trying to develop.
Next question is from Kenneth Chang from the New York Times.
Hi, thank you. This is, I guess, is for Administrator Nelson. You expressed confidence that Boeing will continue, but it's also a first price contract, so potentially they could lose. They've already written up $1.6 billion. Are you saying that you're confident that they will continue to write off money, losing money on this? And I guess the second question is, has there been any discussion with Air Space about converting Dream Chaser for crew? Thank you.
On Sierra, I will let somebody else answer that. with regard to Boeing, remember, it's a fixed price contract. We expect delivery on the contract, and therefore, there is no discussion at this point on NASA's part in the question that you pose, which is basically that they've spent X, will they spend Y to get to where Boeing Starliner becomes a regular part of our crew rotation? That's not, I don't have the answer to that, nor do I think we would have the answer now.
And I'll add about Sierra Space. Sierra's working very hard on their first maiden voyage of the Dream Chaser. That's a cargo mission. They've got the vehicle down at Kennedy, and they're working through test and final assembly. So it's the plan that they fly cargo missions to station through the rest of station. And in fact, that's the scope of the contract that we have with them, to provide cargo capabilities. There is no existing contract with the agency for crewed capability, which doesn't mean that that's not a possibility somewhere in the future. In fact, Sierra has their own goals about moving in that direction in the future. But for now, the work and the focus is on getting them flying as a cargo flight. And if you look back to how we started SpaceX and the Dragons, that's a very similar approach. We started with cargo flights first. We flew a number of flights, and then they eventually evolved into the crewed version of the Dragon.
Next question is from Lauren Grush from Bloomberg.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm wondering, can you walk us through what modifications, if any, will be made to Starliner ahead of its return now that it doesn't have a crew on board? And will NASA be flying that return any differently or watching for anything specifically now that it's performing this return without a crew? Thanks.
I'll take the question relative to the reconfiguration of Starliner. There's a few things that we have to do differently. As I said earlier, we're going to modify the separation sequence a little bit to get away from the space station a little quicker than we had planned. So that's one modification. That will be done via ground commanding, and then there'll be some time-tagged events in the flight software that they'll execute. There are a few items in the cockpit that have to be configured a little differently. Obviously, if you had a crew on board, some of the life support systems will be configured just like we did on the Orbit Flight Test 2 mission in 2022. We'll use those same configurations. Obviously, we've got to do a little bit of planning relative to the center of gravity without the crew members being in the seats. So we've looked at that already, and that doesn't appear to be a big problem. So we've got a few things like that to go work on. The teams have been really laying out all that data. The ground teams will have a little bit different set of flight rules to operate from. So they'll have that ahead of them. But there's a few minor things to the spacecraft to reconfigure, and we're already in the process of starting that work.
Next question is from Will Robinson-Smith from Spaceflight Now.
Yeah, hi, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Question, I believe, for Dana Weigel, or perhaps Steve Stitch. In one of the previous briefings, it was discussed that I think the Russians wanted to see, it was 1 or 2 successful full crew rotation missions of Starliner before they would put one of their cosmonauts on the spacecraft. Has the agency had the opportunity to talk to Roscosmos about the path forward and what the options will be for flying cosmonauts to and from the space station with Starliner at this point? Thank you.
Sure. Our focus with all the international partners, as you can imagine, discussions about what's happening on board or changing launches or operations on board involve not just our NASA team, but the entire international partnership. And so similar to the discussions you've heard today, the focus has been on the decision immediately in front of us with what to do with Starliner crewed or uncrewed. And in fact, when we ended the review today, I sent an email out to all of the program managers across the international partnership so they understood the decision. So they've been following along with us. In terms of Roscosmos thinking about our integrated crew exchanges and flying on the Boeing vehicle, they have always maintained that they want to see a few successful flights before they fly crew on it. I don't expect that that'll change, but we're not actively having those discussions right now. Right now, we're focused on what to do with Starliner, but of course, those are things we'll talk about in the future.
Next question from Irene Klotz at Aviation Week.
Thanks very much. I think this is for Steve. As far as the thruster issues, considering the return of the spacecraft and the performance during OFT 1 and 2, is the primary concern now that because there was the overheating during the approach to station, that there's some uncertainty on how these thrusters are now going to perform during the deorbit? And can you also just give us an update on what the status is on Boeing's preparations to return Starliner without crew, and what, if any, additional risks to the spacecraft are, and granted those are far below risks to crew, but if there are any additional risks at this point in bringing Starliner back uncrewed, since that's not the nominal plan? Thanks.
Yeah, good questions, Irene. What I would say is that the thrusters on this flight relative to Orbit Flight Test 2 have experienced higher heating. We had more thrusters fail off, more thrusters see degradation. In fact, one of them failed off, and we haven't hot fired that. We did 2 docked hot fires at ISS, and we've chosen not to utilize that thruster at all. But they've experienced a little more stress, I would say, than the previous flight. Even though the deorbit burn was successful on OFT, the first orbit flight test and the second one, these thrusters have experienced more stress, more heating, and so there's a little bit more concern for how they would perform during the deorbit burn, holding the orientation of the vehicle, and then also the maneuverings required after that. We've also learned in the starboard doghouse in particular, there is extra heating that we have just discovered in the last 2 weeks. And looking at the data a little more closely, anytime an orbital maneuvering thruster fires in that doghouse, there's higher heating. And so we had one thruster on OFT2 in 2022 fail off after the deorbit burn. It would not surprise me to see one of the starboard aft thrusters in that doghouse fail off in the deorbit burn for this flight. So I would say a little higher heating, a little bit more thermal, and a little more uncertainty now that we understand the physics a little bit better for a crew return. In terms of the preps of the vehicle, we've been getting the vehicle prepared. The team is on the ground, really has gone through and looked at the flight software that's on board. Is there any changes that need to be made to mission data loads? This technique of using a very simplified SEP sequence has minimized the changes required on mission data loads. They're going to take the actual software that we plan to use and put it through its paces in the facility that's a hardware software integration facility that Boeing has. The team has been doing practice runs in a training facility. When I say the team, the ground team has been doing runs just to make sure they understand the differences between the uncrewed and uncrewed. And really, I think it's, I would say, unconnecting muscle memory almost. If you've been training for 2 years to do things a certain way with the flight control team on the ground, with the crew on board, where you can make calls to the crew to do certain actions, they now have to take those actions. And so they've been doing those practices. And there's an integrated simulation next week on Wednesday with the ISS flight control team. The undock sequence is always an orchestrated series of events between how ISS gets configured, how we depress the interface between Starliner and the ISS, how we configure the guidance navigation control for the space station and the software. And so they're going to do that integrated practice next Wednesday. And we'll take our time. If that goes well, we'll pick an undock date. And if it doesn't, we need more simulations, we'll go ahead and pivot. We've laid out a schedule that allows us the opportunity to have some flexibility in Starliner undock, and that's been very important for Dana and I.
Next question is from Jeff Faust from Space News.
Good afternoon. Question for Ken Bowersox or Steve Stitch. You mentioned earlier in the briefing that it was a very close decision on deciding to bring back Starliner uncrewed. I'm wondering if you can quantify that in some way. Was there some particular piece of data or missing piece of data that really swayed that decision, that very close decision? Thank you.
So I'll give it from my point of view, the answer, and then Steve can weigh in. if you look at it, we knew going in that the crewed flight test was probably a little higher risk than a typical rotation with Dragon, where we've flown multiple flights. That's why we called it a flight test, right? We had the issues coming uphill, and that raised our risk level and our uncertainty in how much more risk there was. Anytime you change from your nominal plan that you've spent years developing, you increase risk on the other side. And the type of risks I'm talking about are something that we've analyzed for contingency return with the crew on the mid deck of the Dragon, or the necessity of sending up new suits where the crews weren't able to try out the pressure suits on the ground so that they would have suits on the Dragon. Those types of things raise your risk a little bit on that side. And so now both of your risk levels have gone up, and you knew going in that one was a little bit higher, and you've got uncertainty on just where it fits. So you have to really dig in to understand what the baseline risk change is. And that's what the team has been working so hard this last couple of months. For me, one of the really important factors is that we just don't know how much we can use the thrusters on the way back home before we encounter a problem, because of the heating effects that happened on the way uphill. But Steve can tell you a lot more.
No, thanks, Ken. Yeah, I'll just mention a couple things. One, we had some thruster experts come in and talk to us a few weeks ago, and we are clearly operating this thruster at a higher temperature at times than it was designed for. I think that was a factor that, as we started to look at the data a little bit more carefully, we're operating the thruster outside of where it should be operated in. Understanding, could a thruster just fail off gracefully, or could there be another failure mode that is not so graceful? I think that was an important factor as we talked about the two differences. I mentioned the starboard doghouse, and so for some reason the heating is higher in that starboard doghouse that we do not understand. When an OMAC thruster fires, the other thrusters get heated at a much higher rate than we expected. We don't have a closed loop model to predict the performance. We worked very hard of trying to anchor a model based on what we saw at White Sands, and then knowing what you had in the uphill phase, knowing that you have a model that can replicate what we saw. Can you predict the downhill? We really just couldn't get there over the last number of weeks. Also, how close we were to a cliff. In other words, we've damaged the Teflon on some thrusters. So when we start to fire them again, will that damage repeat or get back to a point where now the thrusters are at the levels we saw on the docking day very quickly? And then really it's the consequences of failure. When we started thinking about the kind of failures we might get, we had those on docking day, and those were even though we were 200 meters from station, it's a very benign environment. This sequence, when the deorbit burn has to execute and then you get into the SEP sequence, it's a very rapid sequence from the completion of the burn to then getting into the separation a number of minutes later, and there's no real time to reconfigure. So when we laid it all out, that's where the preponderance of the risk was to not put a crew on the vehicle.
Our next question is from Manisha Ravasetti from space.com.
Hi, thanks so much for doing this. I think my question is mostly for Dana. I was wondering, what are some of the challenges that you faced in accommodating this delay with ISS operations? I would guess that there are maybe changes you had to make with food allocation or other supplies and task division. And then relatedly, you mentioned that even with this 2025 planned return date, it is the trip is within the scope of what you're comfortable with, for astronauts traveling to the ISS. So what do you think would have been too long for this day, and the point at which we should be, I guess, worried about the fact that they're still up there? Thank you.
Let's see, for the first part of your question, just at a high level from a programmatic standpoint, we protect for about 4 months of what we call consumables reserves. So food, water, different kinds of consumables we have on board. Those are the two biggies. 4 months for 4 crew is what we protect for. So we always stay above that amount. And we do that intentionally so that if we had a problem with the delivery, we a cargo flight that didn't make it, for example, we'd have margin. So we always have a little more than what we need for some period of time. It's not limitless. In this particular case, we did have a resupply mission. In fact, just a few weeks ago, the Northrop Grumman 21 flight came up. So we had our eye on that flight. And so once we realized the team was working through issues and we were likely to have Butch and Sunny on board, we changed that flight's manifest. So we added more supplies to keep us above that reserve level. We've also got the SpaceX 31 cargo flight coming up around the corner. So we've got extra supplies on that. And so we've been able to modify and adjust our cargo mission supplies to accommodate the extra mouths we're feeding. No one has had to go on a diet or calorie restrictions. So we haven't had any limitations there. In terms of duration on board, you ask an interesting question. One of the things as an agency that's really important for us is to understand the impacts of long duration space flight on the crew. And so far our experience base and that of the cosmonaut experience base is up to about 12 months, give or take. And so we understand very well performance implications and what it looks like for operations and crew health there. So you're asking the question about how long is too long. I don't think we as an agency know the answer to that. We can tell you that we understand what 12 months does. We're interested in that from Moon to Mars. And those are some of our research objectives and what we're trying to learn in the microgravity environment, but no specific concerns with 8 months or even up to a year. And so far, our data suggests that as long as we've got the right mitigations on board, exercise, the crew spends about 2.5 hours a day with cardio and weightlifting. And as long as we can keep them in shape with rigorous routines, et cetera, we've done a pretty good job keeping the crew's health up with long duration stay.
Next question is from Tim Fernholtz from Payload Space.
Thank you for taking my question this morning. I was just curious if you have any thoughts now on what might have been done to avoid this scenario after OFT2, if more attention should have been paid to redesigning the propulsion system, or if there were decisions that should have been made during the test campaign to avoid the scenario. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take the question. I think if we look back at OFT2 now with this newer lens of what we learned at White Sands, certainly could we have explored OFT2 in a little more detail, either leading to some redesign of the doghouse to get the thermal environment lower or operate the thrusters differently. I think it's easy to do that in hindsight. If we went back and thought about the whole integrated problem a little bit more, could we have done some kind of testing? What I would say is it's very difficult to test the doghouse environment on the ground. You've got thrusters that fire in multiple directions, and it's very hard on the ground to have a test facility, a vacuum chamber that accommodates thruster firings in multiple directions. So, and then get the thermal right in that doghouse and keep the thermal up. So there was no easy way to do that test on the ground. We thought, obviously, we had done enough analysis to show that the thrusters would be within the temperatures that they were qualified for. Clearly, there were some misses back in qualification. We're going to go through that data in more detail post-flight and then figure out what we can do to go fix them. And then we'll also look at our process. I would say we're going to look at the certification process. I know Boeing's looking at their process as well on how they got here. We're doing the same thing on the NASA side.
Next question is from Sawyer Rosenstein from NASASpaceflight.com.
Hi, thank you so much for taking my question. Earlier you mentioned that there would be a simplified undocking procedure. Can you kind of explain what that means of what this undocking would be like compared to, say, with crew, and what the contingency would be if there is an issue at some point with that undocking and burn away from the station?
Yeah, I can answer the question. So normally we would back away from the space station, essentially go out in front and then above the space station, and then eventually end up below the space station and then on a trajectory that goes beneath it and out in front of the space station. That was our normal plan to undock, heading into the flight before the flight. Now what we're going to do is execute a small number. The undocking itself with the NASA docking system will be exactly the same. we'll use the same techniques. The software will command undocking. We'll drive a sequence of hooks. They'll open up after we've depressurized that area in between the vehicles, and then we'll undock. And there's some springs that push the vehicle away. What we'll do is we'll go through a SEP sequence that puts us on, I would say, what's called a posigrade trajectory. And so we'll end up going essentially phasing out behind the space station to a safe distance, and then we'll get away from the space station, execute the deorbit burn. So we've used that kind of SEP sequence in the past in other vehicles. We've tested this SEP sequence. It is already in the software. It's one of the breakout sequences that are already in the software. And so what we'll do is just go command that sequence early and use that to get away more quickly. And so it's pretty simple, pretty elegant. It was a great idea by the Boeing team.
Our next question is from David Curley from Full Throttle.
Thank you very much. Steve Stitch and Bowersox. I think I heard Stitch say that White Sands testing was kind of the turning point for you. And I thought Bowersox kind of went in a little different direction there. And it seems to me that Boeing and NASA drew different conclusions from those tests. NASA believing that there were potential for losing some of the thrusters. Boeing said at the time that they got pretty close to root cause and were probably within reasonable risk to use them. So did you get to two different conclusions? And was it actually the key factor, the White Sands test, that led to this decision today? And did I hear that you're not ruling out the potential of a 4-person crew for a next Starliner flight?
So let me start with the first question. I think Steve was talking about how we process the data. I was talking about being encouraged by the fact that we had new data. Anytime you have new data, it means that you can analyze it and find out that things are proceeding well, and you can converge the team with that new data. What Steve found was maybe a little bit different, and that's why it probably sounded different how we reacted.
Yeah, I would say at White Sands, we were excited, and that was really a turning point in that we were able to replicate the loss of thrust. We simulated the uphill profile, in other words, how the thrusters fired from the launch sequence into on orbit all the way to docking. We did 2 of those uphill sequences, and then we did a number of downhills. And so we were encouraged when we saw that we could actually see thrust degradation in those downhill runs. What then was new is once we took the thruster apart and we looked at the valve on the oxidizer side, we saw this swelling on the Teflon seat, which when we talked to the vendor, Aerojet Rocketdyne, they had never seen this before in this particular thruster. And so I think that's where there was a change in the risk posture. Initially, we were somewhat excited by replicating the damage, or the degradation in the thrust. But then when we looked a little more closely, we saw this swelling on the Teflon. And then that gave us a whole new idea of the physics involved in the failure mode. And then that led us to study that failure mode a lot more in the last few weeks. Relative to the 4-person Starliner crew, we haven't really had those discussions yet. We need to get the vehicle back. We need to work through our sequence of events on what changes we'll make, both for the helium leaks and the thrusters, and then we'll make a decision on the next flight. It's a little premature to discuss that.
Next question is from David Denault from About Space Today.
Good afternoon. I'd like to see if we can get a individual consensus across the panel. We've talked about the voting. What about the risk assessment? Was it a 50-50 possibility of coming back? Was it a 75-25 decision or a 90-10 decision that Starliner would be safe?
Well, Starliner still has to come back uncrewed, right? And we believe that Starliner coming back uncrewed, although higher than the risk we'd be willing to take to put crew on it, is a reasonable thing to do to finish the test flight and gather the data that we want to gather. To give you a percentage on polling or how people feel, I think that's pretty tough to do. All I can say for sure is that when we polled today, all the people that we asked from the senior management of the different organizations that are involved with human spaceflight, they all concurred that we should have the crew come down on a different vehicle than the current Starliner.
Our next question is from Marvin Marshall from the Space Report News.
Hi, good afternoon. My question is for Administrator Nelson. I'm speaking on behalf of millions who share, the same concern. Given that SpaceX operates 4, soon to be 5 Crew Dragons and 3 Cargo Dragons that can resolve anomalies in days or weeks rather than, months or years, all while receiving, a few billion less than Boeing. So we're just, curious, why does NASA continue to support a company, with a history like this? We get the rationale was to have 2 options to ensure, reliability and redundancy, but that's what you get with SpaceX's ability to operate multiple spacecraft, quickly address anomalies, everything they do. So again, just speaking on behalf of millions, why does NASA continue to fund Boeing?
What is your question?
Why do we continue to fund Boeing? The problems when SpaceX.
Is your question, why does NASA continue to fund Boeing?
Yes.
For the obvious reason that, number one, we need 2 spacecraft to have the redundancy in case one is not available to take crew to and from the International Space Station. Number 2, this is according to an arm's length contract, and a contract that is a fixed price contract. And number 3, Boeing has been a great partner for NASA over the years. As a matter of fact, the big space launch system, the SLS rocket, is overall managed by Boeing. And there has been a long history with Boeing. The 4th reason is that they were the successful bidder along with SpaceX, because we had wanted 2. So for all those reasons, that's why NASA does business with Boeing.
So I'd also like to add, Boeing operates the space station for us as well as the prime contractor for space station, and that's in its 25th year. So we have a long and storied history with them there also.
Yeah, Boeing's been a great partner with us on space station. And I think the key word is partner. A lot of people want to focus on the contractual relationship where we're buying something from a company. This isn't completely like that, right? I mean, we have a contract with Boeing, but it's to work together to develop this capability for our country. And we've had 2 good partners, Boeing and SpaceX, when it comes to commercial crew. And when they have problems, we don't just throw rocks at them or tell them that we don't like them. We work with them to get through those problems.
Our next question is from Jackie Goddard from the Times of London.
Yes, hello, thank you. And just following on from that, can you help us understand why Boeing aren't here and what we're to conclude from that? You used to brief jointly. And whatever the reason may be, was there any discussion around what their absence might communicate to the public? Boeing has been adamant that Starliner is safe. You folks aren't there. We hear that the legacies of Challenger and Columbia have helped to guide your caution at NASA. So how concerned should the public be at the implication that that learning curve at Boeing possibly differs? Thank you.
Well, I'll take the first part, and it looks like Jim's getting ready to take the second part. But the reason Boeing's not here is it was a NASA decision today, crewed, uncrewed. That was the focus of this review. And so we thought it was reasonable to have just NASA on this panel. Jim, anything you want to add?
I think that's correct, Ken. And then I'd add, I think Ken and Steve have characterized that Boeing was part of the decision process. They've characterized what Boeing's position was. So and we're here to communicate the overall NASA position.
Next question is from Natalie LaRoche from the Boston Globe.
Hi there. Thank you so much, everyone, for the answers to our questions. It was mentioned earlier that their families are their pillars of strength right now. I was just wondering how apprised their families are in this whole process, and if you could describe what their spirits are during these times.
Okay, I think if I heard your question right, it was how the families are doing and how we support the families. Again, as I said previous, families are the pillars of strength and support. Their families are doing well. Their families understand, just like the crew members when they launch, there's always an opportunity. There's always a possibility that they could be up there much longer than they anticipate. So the families understand that. I'm not saying it's not hard. It is hard. It's difficult. You have to adjust for that. We have a support structure for the astronauts, and it's there to support the families and the crew members on orbit. So they're doing well. They understand. And again, we thank them for what they do.
All right, we have time for one more question. So to close this out, the last question will be from Bill Harwood from CBS News.
Yeah, thank you very much. A question for Senator Nelson, if I can. All my technical questions were answered, so I have a political question for you. There's been a lot of talk during the past few weeks that we live in an environment today where one presidential candidate is the chairman of the National Space Council, and we live in an environment where criticism is thrown about. I don't know what word to even use for it. The question is this: is there, in your mind anyway, did politics and the ramifications of this decision, if it didn't go well, play any role at all in your decision, your personal decision, Senator, about how to proceed with this? Was politics even in the back of your mind when you guys were talking about all this? Thanks.
Bill, if anyone knows, you know that NASA is not only bipartisan, it is nonpartisan. And that's the way we've tried to operate this agency as long as I've been here. I can tell you unequivocally, from a personal standpoint, that politics has not played any part in this decision. What I said earlier about Challenger and Columbia and the lessons learned and what we've tried to change in a culture in order that safety is our North Star is what we are trying to do in a very hostile environment in which if you make a mistake, it's very unforgiving. So I can tell you unequivocally, I have seen some speculation in the press that because we are in an election season, that decisions may have been made with regard to this announced today with regard to an election. Absolutely has nothing to do with it. And as long as I'm around here, it's not going to.
Thank you, Administrator, and thank you to all of our panelists today. Thank you all for joining us. Stay tuned for more information on NASA's Commercial Crew Program blog at blogs.nasa.gov/commercialcrew. Have a great afternoon.